Good morning, everybody. Glad to see you this morning. Um, we are just going to give it a few more minutes for people to straggle in. It's warm out. I always think that makes people slower. It certainly makes computers slower. While we're waiting, Shirley suggested I tell you a little bit about myself, so you know who is yammering at you. Um, I have been a realtor in San Diego County for, oh gosh, since 1988. I have been a top producing agent. I've been, all of the things. Still a working agent. I still do buy and sell for occasional clients. When you've been in the industry as long as I have, you still have clients that call. In fact, I just had one call me and say, we're getting ready to retire. I sold them their house, so I'm going to sell it for them. That's the kind of business obviously we all aim for. Um, and almost the entire time that I've been in the industry, I have volunteered and worked at the association. Um, and I have always felt that it's important to not just walk the walk. I mean, not just talk the talk, but walk the walk, right? So I put my money where my mouth is. I give of my time. I've been on professional standards for, gosh, over 20 years. I sit hearings. I am a CAR member. I go to all the CAR meetings, both in Sacramento and throughout the state. And I belong to a number of other organizations as well to pay attention to the industry and what's happening in the industry. I believe very strongly, actually, that we are responsible for our own ethics and the way that we move forward in this industry. So I very much commend all of you for joining this and other educational seminars that are being put on to learn the new forms and to stay on top of your industry. It's extremely important. We represent people in the largest purchase of most of their lives and the largest financial obligation that they generally have. And it's important to get it right, and it's important to understand it and to understand the ramifications of the contract and what it means essentially. So thank you so much for participating and being part of this. I believe it's vital basically to our industry. From reading what other people say in the media about us, we aren't exactly held in the highest esteem. So everybody can be responsible for their own little corner of that and be the person that we wish to be perceived as. So thank you again. With that, I think we got enough people in here now. Let's just get going. Um, and the first thing I'm going to do is bring up the um, the CAR page with all of the information on it with the for the new forms. So this page is transactions, and then there's a summary. When you go onto CAR, actually the top of the CAR page, the main page, will have a red ribbon across it, similar to this one. CAR releases forward-looking forms. Read more, and that'll take you to information that you can read about them. And it basically just says we were gonna release them earlier, and then we wanted to make sure that the DOJ was happy with us, and so we've changed a few of them. Um, and this is talking about that as well. So this talks about what these forms are. This is a really handy, maybe bookmark it sort of a page, right? You got the summary of the forms release chart. You've got the forms here. And this also clarifies that there are special town halls on the forms that are coming up from CAR. I know that we have a seminar through the North County Board, I believe on Monday, on the RPA. And there are additional forms classes on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I believe, at CAR. And you can also get a buyer representation and residential listing agreement bundle course free from CAR. So again, and I strongly also support several different versions, going to different classes. You get different things from different people, different styles, different trainings. All of that, I think it can be very important to your to your understanding of the forms and also to just basically your knowledge base, right? And knowledge is power. If you are across the table from somebody who does not understand these forms, you will have a leg up. And unfortunately, so will your client, or unfortunately for the other guy's client, that you will also understand it a little bit better. So the first form that I'm actually going to open here is, and let me grab it real quick, is actually the actually I'm going to go back to that other page. It's actually the description. There it is. The summary guide. So let me share this one with you. And this really does help. I strongly also suggest printing this one out and keeping it just basically as a reference until you get very familiar with. Again, there are a ton of new forms. If you look over, let me make this a teeny bit bigger so you can see it. Otherwise, it's ants, right? If you look on this page here, I mean, this column here, it talks about what this form is and what it replaces. So if you look here, this is new. This is new. This is new. This is new. So these obviously are the ones predominantly that relate to the new DOJ settlement, but there are some other forms in here that are simply kind of an adjusted version of a former form. So we want to make sure that we are paying attention. This one is going to help you just really kind of clarify. The link is car.org. And if you go to car.org, the very opening page is going to have a banner across the front, and it's going to have a link to this page that I just went to. The page with the red on it is the one that is going to have all of this information on it. I'm sure Shirley can also, yeah, she did. She added it as well. She's going directly to this form with the summary on it. But if you go to, again, the first page of CAR, it's going to have for you all of the forms. So it's going to have this summary and then also a link to all of the new forms, including the ones that are new as of last week. So as you remember, a lot of the forms were released earlier, I think 2 weeks ago on Friday. And so this link will actually take you to all of them. This is the newest forms for the purchase agreement, or excuse me, listing agreement that we're going over. The purchase agreement has also been massively changed. But today we are just going to go over the listing agreement and its affiliated forms. All right, so the first one that we're going to go over is actually the listing agreement. So let me grab that one. And here we go. All right, so this form is the residential listing agreement, exclusive authorization and right to sell. So this is the one that was just released, and it is not yet in zip form. So zip form should have it in the next, I don't know, couple of days. It takes them a minute to format all of these new forms. And so it is not yet there. If any of you were on the call with CRMLS, I think it was Thursday, the format for CRMLS is going to change on the MLS to no longer show the broker compensation offering. So this is going to be sooner rather than later. So again, make sure that you are up on all of this. And when your client asks you, you can clearly explain what is going on. So the terms, you'll notice that this really has changed. The listing agreement has the graph just like the purchase agreement did, which honestly, I think makes it easier. And so this clarifies, this is the parcel number, the address, etc., for the listing period specified in 2A. Remember up above, it used to have from date to date. Now this just moves it down to the graph itself. So the graph itself talks about paragraph 2A1. So this is 2A1, and this is the listing period beginning on this date, ending at this date. And the other thing that's been added here is that there is a maximum length. So I don't remember if any of you were or have seen, there were a number of listings taken by a company, I think it was out of Florida, that were like, 20 years. We're going to pay you money now, and you're going to, whenever you sell your house, it has to go through us. Well, that was deemed to be illegal. That's one of the reasons this was added. So this is now not to exceed 24 months if improved with 1 or 4 units and not owned by an entity. That's an important clarification. Some of the companies that do remodels are LLCs or corporations or entities, and they can have a listing that exceeds 24 months. If the listing period exceeds 24 months on the residential 1 to 4, this agreement is void unless the seller is, as I mentioned, the LLC or partnership, one of those companies. Then you have very clearly listing price. Then you have the property specific listings. So if this is a manufactured home or a probate, conservatorship, or guardianship, you simply check here. These used to be separate forms. This is now just this form with that box checked. So make sure if that's something you're working on, you understand, again, this process and can explain it to your clients. Here's the part that is basically where the rubber meets the road. This is the rub. The compensation, and again, this is going to be said a bazillion places in all of our forms from here on out. Not that I didn't say it before, but now we're really, really meaning it. Compensation notice, the amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between seller and broker. See attached broker compensation advisory, CAR form BCA, which we'll go over in a minute. So again, you'll notice that this form only talks about the seller and the broker. It's not talking about anybody else being involved in that transaction. Ooh, where did we go here? Hold on. Huh. Where did my form go? Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So the additional, excuse me, the compensation to seller's broker, and the only one that you're concerned with is the seller's side of the transaction in this box. So 4B, which is in the contract further down, will explain this paragraph, or I mean this box. It says what percent of the listing price and, if any, an amount or a percentage or amount, or if you have a compensation schedule. So if, for example, you have, if it's sold in the first 2 weeks, we have this amount. If it's, sold after that, it's this amount. Or if it's net based or any of those things that clarify what that commission is, that's what you would add, is the compensation schedule. The second C2 says additional compensation to seller's broker if the buyer is unrepresented. So if in your discussion with your seller, you say, gosh, Mr. Seller, one of the things that I do to sell your property is I hold a number of open houses. And in those open houses, occasionally a buyer will come through that is not represented by another agent. And if I represent that buyer, I would like to have the compensation taken care of in the purchase price as part of that agreement with that buyer. You can agree to that in advance. I will say, if you have an amount that's specified in this section, you can only receive that amount. So if, for example, you're working with a buyer and your seller says, okay, if you bring in the buyer, I'll pay you an additional, 3 bottles of wine. Okay. And then your buyer says, all right, I'll work with you and I'll go look at, 20 houses, and I'll pay you 10 bottles of wine. Well, at this point, you're only able to accept the 3 bottles of wine that you've agreed to in this agreement for this purchase. If that buyer buys another property, then that buyer representation agreement would work for those other properties. But on this property, you've already agreed to a lesser amount and you cannot exceed that amount. The continuation of your right to compensation for broker-identified prospective buyers. So that's if, for example, you've had this listing for 3 months, you haven't done your job, or you have done your job, but nobody bought it. But you have 3 buyers that are maybe super excited about it, right? This is where you put those names. And you have to have the buyers identified, not just the guy that came through with Shirley at Remax, right? You want to also have in here a seller obligation to pay previous brokers. So again, if you are the recipient of this listing because the other guy couldn't sell it and Shirley is an exemption, then you're going to put that here. And this section clarifies who this seller owes a commission or a compensation to. Okay, so then we have in this section, items intended to be included and excluded. So items included are, refrigerator, if they want to include the washer and dryer, all that kind of stuff. Excluded items, next line is, great Aunt Edna's chandelier that's in the entryway, anything that they don't want to have included in the sale of that property. And just as a practical note, you can always want to remove those anyway. If Great Aunt Edna's chandelier is the most gorgeous thing you've ever seen, every single buyer is going to want it. They're all going to fight over it. So I would just, as a matter of practicality, remove it and put in another chandelier. Even if it's just a holder chandelier, and they can replace it with their Great Aunt Edna's chandelier. Okay, so the question is, what is the form to, this is the form, the continuation of right to compensation for broker identified prospective buyers. The continuation period shall be however many calendar days. That's in the old format. You used to put down there 120 or 30 or 90 or whatever it was after the listing period. And the identified prospective buyers. Oh, are you talking about how you identify the prospective buyers? That is a different form, and we will get to that. Okay, so the previous listing, other brokers, you name them here. If there are more, it'll automatically go to another page. The compensation to above brokers, if the property is transferred to, and then the buyer's name is here. Okay, items intended to be included or excluded. We did this. Leased items, propane tanks, solar power, water softener, alarm system. And you'll note that solar power is printed here twice. Because sometimes it's leased and sometimes it's owned and sometimes it's not paid off yet. And sometimes there's a specific buying product that happened and then there's a lien against the property. So all of that is clarified in through here. You want to make sure that anything that's leased or liened is noted in here. And by the way, for included and excluded items, whatever you put in the MLS, though it should be correct, must still also be written into a contract. So you definitely can negotiate even still. If you've put something in the MLS and the seller doesn't want to at the price that the buyer has agreed to, those are all still negotiable. These are not concrete items, but you do want to be accurate. The smart home items the seller prefers to include and exclude. For the longest time when they were new, I think, Ring doorbells were like the hot ticket item and everybody was mad about either getting them or leaving them or not getting them. And, that has since sort of gone by the wayside, but now we have a lot of technical equipment that's attached, for example, to cameras. And you want to make sure that if something like that is of importance to your client, you note it. So again, that is all about the conversations that you have with your client and make sure that you discuss this stuff because when you don't and it becomes a problem later, they're going to blame you. So the property will be marketed in the following MLS. So if you belong to more than one, obviously it's going to be primary and then other. And then there's a MLSA. It's an MLS addendum, which again, we will go through. And this clarifies some of the details about the MLS and how that compensation specifically is to be addressed in the MLS. The fact that it is not any longer a non-revocable offer of compensation, it is negotiable. The seller instructs broker not to take or use photographs in marketing except as required by MLS rules. This has become, oddly, a really hot button item lately, with buyers wanting the photos taken down off the MLS after they buy the property. That is not something that they have control over. And those photos, once uploaded, belong to the MLS. Okay, let me look at these questions really quick. Yes, that prospective buyer's form. Okay. Do we need to redo the current RLAs being used with active listings since this one now goes into effect? Well, it sort of depends. If you have a current listing, actually, you can't use this form yet. So not yet. Once it does go into effect and is uploaded to the to zip form, CAR no longer will support any previous versions of the forms. So the legal protections that are written into these forms and the legal protections provided by CAR and their attorneys, and more than likely your E&O, will no longer be in effect if you are utilizing an older contract. That being said, you can use frankly, I would just rewrite the contract depending on how long it is. If you go into escrow between now and then, that's kind of a question for your broker. But I would just say that once these forms go into effect and they are up and utilized, the protections afforded by the CAR legal team, and again, more than likely your E&O insurance, most E&O insurance coverage has a codicil that says you must use the latest form of the CAR contract. The offer of compensation to the selling broker is on the old form and is deemed illegal. No, it's not illegal yet, actually. It is, it's more than likely going to be part of the settlement agreement, but that is not going to go into effect until mid-August sometime. And actually, we've heard rumors that maybe later. I kind of don't put anything past the DOJ and our government right now, but that currently is not illegal. It is simply not the direction that we are looking at going, and it's not the direction CAR is pushing. And again, once these forms go into effect, they will not be supported by the legal representation of CAR, and again, more than likely your E&O insurance. But again, talk to your broker and find out what exactly you have to do. Some brokers are allowing just modification of terms. Some are doing other things, which again, I kind of don't want to get into because it's a myriad of choices that your broker will have to settle for. If the forms are in effect, but CRMLS has not updated the fields, are we basically saying once forms are released, we are in the new regime? But CRMLS will not be in sync with the forms until 8/13. The settlement, once it goes into effect, will make that requirement obligatory. Thank you, that's the word. And the MLS will have a compensation section, which you can utilize, and they already have that in place. So I don't think it's going to be CRMLS that has the issue with that. They are definitely forward thinking. But this, again, is going to be the forms that you use. And with these forms, you will no longer have the other forms available. Once those go out of zip form, they'll be gone. And so this will be the form that you use. Okay. Brokers and sellers' duties. The timing of the presentation of offers. Now, this one, actually, people have not paid a whole lot of attention to, and kind of need to. Because it says the seller instructs broker to present all offers received as soon as practicable, or offers shall be presented on X date or however many days after the property is listed as active on the MLS. And by the way, this does not say once you get an offer, you don't have to accept anymore. Unless you have written instruction from your seller saying do not accept any more offers, you can. You can present them and suggest that maybe they go in backup, or just present them. in case anything should happen. I mean, it's really up to your seller. But again, you don't get to make that decision for your seller. Your seller gets to make that decision. The seller instructs broker to not to present, and the automatic is not to present buyer letters. And the seller instructs brokers to present buyer letters. If the seller requests or relies on the buyer letters, seller is acting against broker advice. We all know why this is, because it could lead to probably inadvertent, but discrimination or a perception of discrimination, perhaps. Investigative reports. The one that's automatically checked is a natural hazard disclosure. That is a state requirement that be provided. And then the other ones can be checked. And this is the responsibility of the seller, not to be confused with what the buyer wants or needs or is going to ask for. This is the requirement of the seller. So this natural hazard disclosure will also clarify for that seller whether they're in a high or very high fire zone, which will clarify whether they need to do the secondary fire form as well. The other forms, they can be helpful. A lot of times a pest control form, a pest control inspection during or before you list a property can be helpful. There have been occasions when a pest control company, knowing that a property is an escrow and that timing is of an issue, has maybe, charged a little more than they might ordinarily. The exceptions to ownership or title are to be clarified here. Whether the seller intends to include a contingency to purchase a replacement property, you check that box and it'll automatically add the additional form. And if the seller wants to opt out of a key safe or a lockbox or signs. Some communities do not allow signs, for example, or they only allow certain size signs inside a property, mostly condos, but I've seen it in certain areas like Rancho Santa Fe does not allow signs. So there's a number of things that you want to make sure that you check and you know about your community and or your client. And make sure that you check these forms if these boxes, if that is the case. Then any additional terms, my cousin Vinny is going to come show it to his uncle Bob, and, you're going to pay him a commission if that happens, or not a commission, a referral. Then that would be where you would put that. The broker compensation advisory form is automatically linked to this form now. This one was also completely redone, and we will again go over this one next because it's an automatic link. And then if it's a short sale, obviously you'll check this, REO, trust advisory, all of those forms depending on the nature of the transaction. Any addenda are identified below and incorporated in this agreement. You would check the box, add what it is, and obviously add whatever the addenda is. So if there is something that is important to your seller, that's where you would put that. The advisory, this one is important because the broker compensation advisory will restate this, but it says it here as well. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to broker and are fully negotiable. The seller agrees to pay brokers compensation for services under this agreement, the amount specified in paragraph 2C1, which, as I mentioned, was up here as the compensation to seller's broker, and it's only your half of the transaction, right? So we have been used to in the past having that full amount negotiated and then putting the little section down below where we're going to throw this pittance to the other guy. So now we don't get to say what the pittance is. The other guy gets to negotiate his own, which frankly, I think makes sense. But it does create a little bit of confusion when we're filling out these forms. Now back down here, the optional additional compensation for unrepresented buyers. That's that other section right below there. If no other brokerage company is involved, that guy says, I want to work with you. Then you want to fill out another form which clarifies what those compensation terms are. And if you have pre-agreed with your seller to have that amount built in, so to speak, to what he is expecting to work with, then that's where this would come in. Completed transaction or seller default. And this clarifies how everybody gets paid. once this deal is closed. If during the listing period or any extension, the broker or any other broker, seller, or any other person procures a ready, willing, and able buyer whose offer to purchase the property on any price and terms is accepted by the seller, providing the buyer completes the transaction, that's an important part, and is prevented from doing so by seller. The broker is entitled to compensation whether any escrow resulting from such offer closes during or after the expiration of the listing period or any extension. So you're all ready to close. Day before close, seller says nope and pulls out. You would be able to negotiate this clause. The continuation of right to compensation for broker procured buyers. If during the continuation period specified in paragraph 2C3 or the same time, this is the similar form to what was negotiated in the previous listing agreement. Once you've canceled this listing, or the seller has canceled this listing, or it runs out, but you've shown that property to X, Y, and Z buyers during that time frame, you are permitted to go after the seller, or the sellers should pay you for those purchases. The broker's right to compensation pursuant to this paragraph shall only apply if prior to the expiration of this agreement, broker delivers to seller a written notice of the names. That hasn't changed, but this is just a little bit more clarified and identified in this form. The seller in interference with listing, if without the broker's prior consent, the property is withdrawn. This is, again, he changes his mind the day before close and just says nope, or for any other reason. It's an involuntary, it's made unmarketable by a voluntary act, excuse me, of the seller during the listing period. And then additional compensation terms. The buyer breach and seller recovery of damages clarifies what happens if the sale is prevented by a party to the transaction. And then escrow instructions, seller hereby irrevocably assigns to broker the above compensation from seller's funds. So this is your irrevocable offer of compensation, but it's only your side, unless, as I said, you mentioned in that section above, that the seller has agreed to compensate the buyer's agent if you bring the buyer. So the seller's compensation obligations to other broker has not previously entered into any other listing agreements. He says he hasn't, he swears it, or here's the names of the people he has. And if the property is sold to anyone specified in that section during the time that he's obligated to compensate him, he is obligated to do so. And you, the current broker, is not obligated to represent the seller in such a transaction. The maximum listing period, again, I mentioned that was 24 months. This clarifies this. Again, this is a new section. So that's why it's in red. But you cannot go more than 2 years on a listing. The item, and I think this is interesting because the listing is 2 years, but the buyer representation agreement is 3 months. I guess they think that the buyer will find a house faster, or but those can be renewed. The items included and excluded, again, clarifies what those are. Liened and leased and or not owned items, clarified and explains why that is. If they have been financed and a lien has been placed on the property, seller will provide to the buyer as part of the purchase agreement copies of lease documents and other documents obligating seller to pay for any such leased or liened item. The smart home features are intended to be included or excluded as specified in paragraph 2D5. Again, that has been a fiddly little thing with people arguing over cameras, etc. It clarifies the broker responsibility, the strategies affecting the delayed offers, and buyer broker compensation. And this is an interesting part because it's kind of a moving target. It says certain buyers may not be able or allowed to pay compensation of buyer's broker. These buyers may request for seller to pay buyer's broker through a term in the purchase agreement or through a separate compensation agreement. Seller is advised to discuss and consider the best strategy for seller related to the presentation of offers. This refers both to unrepresented buyers, but also, for example, a VA buyer who up until, gosh, about a month ago, was prohibited from paying any of the buyer's fees. So that has been temporarily allowed, and we'll see what happens with that in the long term. one of the things that I think lenders have been slower to understand is that price up until now has always included the representation for both sides. And it has always been wrapped into that loan. And so that's a discussion that's happening at the lender level, because honestly, that's the way that most buyers are going to be able to pay their representation, their agents, because frankly, a lot of buyers are struggling to come up with down payments, especially in the current market and interest rates, et cetera. And so having that discussion with your seller, look, this buyer pool shrinks radically when you only allow people to pay for their own representation. So when you allow them to roll that into the loan by having it be part of the purchase price, you can negotiate that price and that agreement if you haven't built that in. And that's why it's really important for us as agents and brokers to provide a net sheet to that seller and explain to them what their net is based on the numbers as you know them. And I think that might change a little bit for each one of those buyers, because they're going to have different agreements with their agents and their brokerages. But that's something that you have to have an ongoing, open communication with your sellers about what that number actually is. And the fact that many buyers are going to be looking just like they have for closing costs. But even it's something as simple as it needs a new roof. And so, you're going to give it credit for that. And it needs a new flooring. So you're going to give it credit for that. Well, it needs a representation. So, you can look at it that way as well. And again, when you roll that into the price of that property, it allows them to put it into the loan. And currently that is allowed temporarily, at least, by the VA. So now the seller instructs broker to present offers. And again, as I mentioned, if you're going to have him say no after you've got offers, you have to have that in writing. Or he is instructed not to present offers until a later time. Again, you have to clarify that. Buyer letters, we went over that, what that is, why we don't want those. And the seller good faith. So one of the things that you really need to remember about real estate in general and contracts, and that is that it's all based on fair dealing and good faith. And if you look at it from the standpoint of what's fair for both sides, not necessarily the best deal for both sides, but what's fair for both sides, generally speaking, that involves clarity, understanding, and transparency in the transaction, which is where we're going with this. Here's what I'm being paid. Here's how I'm being paid. And that's what this clarifies. Investigation reports, it clarifies what that timing is. And again, this is a conversation you're going to want to have with your seller and kind of go through this paragraph by paragraph. You can work it out, maybe do conversations in your office, have one guy pretend to be the seller, have one guy pretend to be the listing agent, and go through the contract and have him ask questions. And, get prepared, because the more you practice this stuff, the better you're going to be at it. And that way you can present it to your seller. All reports specified in paragraph 2F3 are the responsibility of the seller. So again, you want to be careful. You're going to expect the buyer to do some reports. In Northern California, it's actually done. Almost all of it is done by the seller before they even have the buyer write an offer. That's not how we do it down here. And our traditional agreements don't include all of those reports. Some sellers are fine with it. Some sellers aren't. In some cases, as I mentioned, it can be helpful. Having an inspection before you go to market sometimes can be good, because you're going to get rid of some of the issues, but it can also be bad in that you have a seller who thinks his house is perfect now, right? So that can be a negative. So again, you got to work that with your seller. You have that conversation with them and make sure that it's open communication, and explain the positives and negatives to anything that they choose to do. Undisclosed conditions, incomplete or incorrect information. Seller further agrees to indemnify, defend and hold broker harmless from all claims. This never happens, but it's in here. Claims, disputes, litigation, judgment, and costs arising from any incorrect or incomplete information supplied by seller, or from any material facts that the seller knows but fails to disclose, including dangerous or hidden conditions of the property. We've all had that seller that says, yeah, well, we had some mold, but we cleared it up and I don't want to tell the buyer. No, you want to make sure that all of that stuff gets identified and clarified. Okay, where am I here? There we go. The seller acknowledges receipt of a disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship. That's long been attached. The seller representation, except in 4F3, which again is talking about the unrepresented buyer. Disclosure and consent in a transaction. Again, this form is pretty similar to what it has been. Showing properties. Okay, so here's where we get a little bit of a difference in what's coming versus what's been. Seller acknowledges that real estate brokers must have a written agreement in order to work with a buyer before showing properties to that buyer, and that some buyers working through broker may consider or make an offer on seller's property. Seller consents to broker entering into a representation agreement with the buyer, and if that buyer makes an offer on seller's property, the broker will become a dual agent representing both that buyer and seller. Potentially competing sellers and buyers. Seller understands that the broker may have or obtain listings on other properties, and that the potential buyers may consider, make offers on, or purchase through broker property the same as or similar to seller's property. Seller consents to broker representation of sellers and buyers of other properties before, during, and after the end of this agreement. Seller acknowledges receipt of a possible representation of more than one buyer and seller. So that form has been in effect, but this clarifies that we now have to have an agreement with buyers in order for them to see the property. So if somebody comes into that property, is not represented, and you represent them, again, up in that section of the form, you can already have a negotiated payment that you're going to pay them, or you can just say, I'm going to either have them be represented potentially by me, potentially by the person holding the open house, which presumably is going to be somebody from your office, which would still create a dual representation agreement. So if a buyer is interested in viewing seller's property and it is already not represented by a real estate broker, such buyer refuses to be represented by the broker. Seller authorizes broker to obtain a signed document from such buyer refusing representation by broker. Broker shall provide such buyers at the earliest practicable time. That's such a weird word, practicable. Disclosure of non-representation, such as buyer non-agency, which is B&A, or open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. The ONA, it's the Hawaiian form, ONA-C. The confirmation, the broker shall confirm the agency relationship described above, blah, 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 termination of agency relationship. These are all similar to what existed before. Security insurance showing audio and video. So this has been in the form for a while, but I really wanted to kind of go over it a teensy bit because it's one of the things that again has come up again, and that is the audio and video. And who is allowed to take them, and what do you do with them, and can people come in and just take video of your house, etc. So Lori asks, some sellers do not want the listing agent to also represent the buyer. This seems to indicate listing agent has the right to do so. How is the seller's preference to be indicated here if it is not to represent a buyer? You just tell them you don't want them to represent the buyer, and then that's the agreement that you have. And you can have that as part of your agreement. What this says, however, is that if somebody else from your company represents that buyer, then that still creates dual agency. The agency is with the broker, not with the agent. But you can absolutely clarify in your form, in this form, the seller or the seller's agent will not represent the buyer in any transactions. So if you get the buyer not represented by anyone and you get buyer's agreement, so you go back, the modification of terms for additional compensation from seller or needs to incorporate it from what? From get-go and listing agreement? Yeah, we're talking about, that's talking about the buyer representation agreement. Yes. If you have a buyer, you go back, modification of terms for additional compensation from seller or needs to incorporate it from get-go on listing agreement. No, actually, I get what you're asking. If you have a buyer that is not represented and agrees to work with you, and you have not signed that second section in the listing agreement that specifies what you will pay or what the seller will agree to pay, should you represent a buyer, then you simply have a buyer representation agreement and you negotiate it just like any other listing. You would fill out 3G3 in the contract and negotiate that discussion during the negotiation of the terms of the contract, just like any other buyer and any other term. There is nothing really special. I mean, it's how we get paid, but there's nothing special about that negotiation that happens outside of the contract. It's now part of the contract because it's part of what the buyer's negotiating for. Do represented buyers have to provide a buyer broker representation agreement prior to touring a property? Yes and no. They have to either be represented by an agent. If they have an agent with them, they have to have that form, or they have to sign a form that's saying that they refuse to sign a representation agreement to view that property. It comes down to the question of whether or not you should be a bouncer at the door, right? My seller has requested that all buyers sign in and either have a representation agreement or sign this form that says they don't want to have a representation agreement, which again, we will go over in a minute. But if they don't have a representation agreement and they say that they don't want to sign anything, your seller has the opportunity or the ability to say, go ahead and let them in, even though they won't tell you who they are and what they're doing here. Or they can say, no, I don't want them to come in my house if they don't give me any information. I don't want people I don't know wandering my house for no reason. But that is your seller's choice. But again, you're not going to be like tackling people at the door. You can simply post a sign that says no entry unless you have an agreement signed and an agent, or we'll sign this form that says you don't. Where do you suggest that clarification be noted in the RLA? Additional terms? It's just if they have a term that they want you to fulfill, put that in additional terms. In order to effectively market the property, you should have photos. Unless you check paragraph 2E2, you're going to have photos. This is an important part, though. If nobody has read this paragraph in a while, seller also acknowledges that once the images are placed on the internet, neither broker nor seller has control over who can view such images and what use viewers may make of the images, or how long such images may remain available on the internet. Seller further assigns any rights and all images to the broker and the agent and agrees that such images are the property of the broker and the agent, and that the broker and the agent may use such images for advertising, including post-transaction and for broker or agent's business in the future. So that's actually why you have to have a property images release, which is in the forms, but that will allow those images to be utilized in the future. If you have somebody that's nervous about their information, maybe artwork, maybe special couch, or I don't know what it is they'd be worried about, but people worry about these things. If they're worried about that getting out there, you want to make sure that you don't have that property sent to other like Zillow, Redfin, all those other companies that take that as and put it out on the internet, because you have no control after the fact. The only control you have is to keep it maintained within the MLS structure itself. And you don't want it to go to secondary sites, then you would make sure you check that when you list it. But again, that's a discussion you want to have with your seller if that's important to them. And that's part of that negotiation and discussion when you take that listing. You want to make sure that you have that conversation with them and take that and make sure you have that secondary box check that does not allow it to be, why am I not thinking of the word, sent out to the other internet formats. Unless they say no, you are going to install a key box, lockbox. And unless they say no, you're going to install a sign. Don't the images belong to photography? That's why I said you have to have a release, photography release. Okay, before about, I don't know, 2 or so years ago, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, there was a lawsuit from a photographer for the use of for the use of photos from a real estate website that had, those properties have been sold, and the website continued to show them as part of their advertising. And the photographer sued and won because it was intellectual property. And the release agreement for those photos, when the agent bought them, only stated that they were to be utilized for the use of the advertisement of that house and no further. So the new format, and most of CRMLS, by the way, most of their photographers, they have a list on their site of photographers that are approved that have already signed a release form, and it's basically in perpetuity. So that photo, once it's purchased by the agent and or homeowner, is sold to that agent and or homeowner in perpetuity, which means it can continue to be utilized after the sale of that property is effected. The agent can continue to use it in sales, like I've sold this house, or any other use for it. That is part of the point, however, when you take a listing on a property, you can't just go take those photos and reuse them because they're actually owned by the previous agent and or homeowner. So in this case, it's going to be the agent because the seller in this form releases that to the agent, and it's no longer their property. But you cannot use it without permission. But that, yes, that was addressed, and it was resolved with that property release form. Okay, so unless they've signed it, they're going to put a sign. Equal housing is the same. Attorney's fees are the same. All of these forms are the same. Mediation, arbitration. Make sure you have your clients read those paragraphs and understand them if they have questions. That's something that you should probably speak to your broker about. We actually have a form, I'm sure your broker does too, that clarifies what those mean essentially, and whether or not they want to discuss with an attorney whether they should sign them. Most people just do, but you do occasionally have that one engineer that wants to read the entire contract word for word and asks you about every other word. So there are forms, and there are availability, by the way, of the CAR hotline does have attorneys who can help you explain that as well. Ownership, title, and authority. The seller warrants that the seller is the owner of the property. No, nobody else owns it. And again, it's clarified in that paragraph 2G. Legally authorized signers. We're all aware of the new format that includes the ability to sign as a trust in the format itself. By signing below, the seller acknowledges they've read and understand the agreement. And then here's that section I'm just talking about. If the property is sold under the jurisdiction of a probate court, the seller is identified, excuse me, as executor or administrator, or of a simplified name. So if it's the John and Mary Smith Family Trust dated blah, 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 John Smith and Mary Smith can just sign it as John Smith and Mary Smith. And this gives them the right to do that. The rest of it is pretty much the same, and more than one agent from the same firm represents the seller. Additional agent acknowledgement. So when you've got teams or you got partnerships or whatever, that's where you would put this, and you would do the additional agent form that would just automatically apply or attach if you click on that form. Okay. So let's go to the BCA form, which is the one that is automatically going to be attached when you pull up this listing and you go to meet with your fantastic sellers. There we go. All right, so the BCA. This has been out. It's currently out, but this is the new version of this BCA. And you can see the red is the change, which is always fun. So listing agreements compensation is fully negotiable. I know it comes as a shock to all of you, but it is. They are not fixed by law, fully negotiable between seller and the seller's broker. Optional additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. So again, this has that box in the form. It's also clarified in the paragraph on that contract below, and then also here. So again, when you're going through this information with your seller, you want to make sure that they understand what it is that they're agreeing to or not agreeing to. When you're discussing with them things like, historically, the agents have been represented as they brought in the buyer, all of those things. However, Mr. Seller, you are not obligated to pay anybody. It may or may not be in your best interest, and we can discuss that. You want to make sure it's very, very, very clear that they do not have to, they are not obligated to, and they aren't required to pay for the buyer's representation. Just like they're not obligated to or pay for any repairs. It says it right in the contract. How many times have you had a buyer come through a property, look at it, and immediately ask for a bunch of repairs, right? The seller can literally at that point say, no, I'm not going to do it, and bye-bye. Sellers generally want to negotiate. They're there because they want to sell their house. So it's the same situation here. You don't have to do anything, sir. You don't have to do repairs. You don't have to pay anybody anything. You don't have to anything unless you decide that it is in your interest to do so. And again, that's where your net sheet is going to come in. That's where you're going to be able to present, here's what your net is. Okay, if they want you to pay this for the roof and this for the compensation and this for your flooring, let's increase your price by this. And here's what your net is going to be now. That's where you have this discussion. Optional buyer additional compensation if the buyer is unrepresented. A listing agreement may include additional compensation toward amounts owed to the seller broker for situations where the broker takes on additional responsibilities or workload. So that's when you're saying, all right, this guy came into this property and he wants me to represent him. I'm going to have to be doing a little bit more work for this guy. I'm going to be here to, meet with his inspectors. I'm going to have to explain everything to him. I'm going to have to make sure that he has all his forms properly and he does the inspections that he needs to. And for that, I would like to be compensated. You can have that discussion with your seller. And if he agrees to pay you, then, or to pay the buyer's obligation to pay you, that this is what this is talking about. So if he agrees in advance to do it, this is what this is talking about. So the broker may represent both buyer and seller, dual agency. Again, this can be you or another agent. So if your seller does not want you to represent both sides of a transaction, and frankly, I kind of agree with that one, because I don't know how you can be neutral when you're trying to make both sides win. But if you have this same company, you're still dual agency. And that is perfectly legal and allowed. Actually, both versions are perfectly legal and allowed. And this clarifies, you want to go through these 2 paragraphs with your seller so that they understand what their rights are. So a broker agreement with buyers is separate, and this clarifies how that's separate. So it's fully negotiable between the buyer and the buyer's agent, whether that's you or somebody else or somebody from your own firm, but not you, right? So the requirement, as I mentioned earlier, every agreement between a principal and an agent must be in writing. And it says, pursuant to a nationwide class action lawsuit reached by the NAR, participants in MLS services are required to have a written agreement with the buyer prior to showing a buyer a residential property or giving a buyer a tour of such a property. The agreement must identify the amount of compensation to be paid for the broker for services provided and require the broker cannot receive any compensation in excess. Again, 2 bottles of wine, 10 bottles of wine. You can only take the 2. Of the amount specified in the agreement. Pursuant to legislation expected to become law in California, all licensees showing a buyer any type of property will be required to have a written agreement with that buyer prior to showing. That's a question that's come up a bunch. If you'll note the date on here, January 1st, 2025, that's all buyers. That means agents who are not realtors, agents who are not members of NAR. This will also apply to them. So we have a responsibility as of, I believe it's August 15th or somewhere in the 18th, 23rd, somewhere in there. And this will go into effect for everybody on January 1st, 2025. So I've heard a lot of talk about how we will be at a disadvantage because they can do whatever they want and we can't. true for a couple of months, but I believe the professionalism of our industry stands alone and will make a difference. When you're facing a murder conviction, are you going to hire the guy that just got his license? Is it going to give you a discount rate, or are you going to hire the guy that represented? Who are the two guys that killed their parents and got off? Anyway, you want somebody who's got some experience behind him, right? So that's the point here. You want to be able to have this discussion, talk to your clients, make sure that the professionalism of the industry and your workers at your offices are all on clear display. Advantages of written agreements. This is kind of a no-brainer, but look, they do put it in writing. A written agreement establishes clear mutual expectations and helps avoid misunderstandings over the buyer and the broker's duties and the amount of compensation the buyer's agent is to be paid. I always say that good fences make good neighbors. Why? Because it gives clear delineation of lines. Same thing with a contract. That's exactly what a contract does. It gives a very clear delineation of how far this goes and that goes and where you're going to end up and how it's going to work. That's exactly the same principle. It gives a clear written mutual expectation of what's going to happen. When enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. Again, this is the part that's changing. The fact that we are representing a buyer and a seller, and that we have an escrow, and that the money is paid out of that transaction has not changed. Where it is in that transaction is what's changing. You're going to have some people that are ready, willing, and able to close a cash transaction, and it's not going to be as necessary for them to perhaps roll that compensation into a loan. That's going to be a different negotiation than it would be with somebody who needs help with the compensation, maybe closing costs, something else, that needs repair. So those are the two extremes of the negotiation. But guess what, guys? That's what we've been training for our whole lives, right? How many of you have never negotiated a contract where something was not an agreement at the beginning? It's where we are today. Okay, so the seller pays the compensation. The buyer negotiates for the seller to compensate buyer's broker. A buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller, and that's the 3G3 in the contract. And the buyer's agent negotiates agreement directly with seller. I'm sorry, this is 3G3 in the contract. This is where the cash guy pays his guy himself. This is 3G3 in the contract. B2, if a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency, then it goes directly into that section of the contract where he agrees to pay the unrepresented buyer representation because you're going to be doing the extra work. The changing practice related to a seller's broker's offer of compensation. In case you've been asleep for the last year, we used to use an MLS to make a unilateral offer of compensation. And now we're not going to be doing that anymore. Now, the seller NAR settlement prohibits the seller's broker from using MLS to make such an offer of compensation. So the California Realtors Association listing agreement no longer provides for such offers of cooperating broker compensation, and they don't include any other forms in this library of forms that might facilitate such offers. Buyers and sellers must separately negotiate compensation with their respective brokers as specified above. So again, as clear as possible, this is how each side is going to get paid. If they are represented, if they are unrepresented, and if I represent them. Here's what the options are. All of these choices are really up to both sides to negotiate together. Your seller can pre-negotiate with you if somebody comes in that isn't represented, that you are going to represent, or as I think somebody mentioned, they don't want you to represent that buyer. Then that can be clarified as well. But again, in writing, clearly understood, you're going to represent them, in which case you can pay them this, or I don't want you to represent anybody that is not represented. I don't want you to have both sides of this transaction. You can write that into the contract as well. That's not particularly common. I don't think I've actually ever seen that. But there are certainly, I think now more discussion of that. Okay, before we scooch to anything else, anybody else have any other questions on those two forms? Let me go look at these real quick. Yeah, okay, no, we're good. All right. So the next form that I'm gonna have us just have an exciting time with is the MLS listing. Multiple listing service addendum. Okay, so when you take a listing, you are presumably going to put that property in the MLS. And so does the seller, before we scooch onto this, does the seller or the listing agent have the right to deny dealing with an unrepresented buyer who chooses to remain unrepresented? This question was asked on the format with CAR, with the brokers and industry leaders format with the attorney for CAR answered it and basically said, not really. Because you run into issues of discrimination. If you are not representing that buyer, they could say why, that it was a form of discrimination that they were not represented. There could be quite a bit of at least not showing the house to them. You can not represent somebody who doesn't want to pay you, absolutely. But not showing the property to somebody because they don't want to be represented. In other words, they've signed who they are, but they are not going to be represented by a buyer. You can't do that. Can you say to them, I will not represent you for free? Sure, absolutely. That's completely allowed. And good luck finding somebody who will. Or they can represent themselves. They can purchase that property without an agent if they want to. You can have that conversation with your seller and look at that offer with basically the same eye that you would look at any other offer. And that is with regard to the the financial terms and the time. An offer isn't just money, it's terms, it's time, it's a bunch of things. And if this agent is not represented and is unaware of the requirements of that transaction, then that does pose a question that you may have with your seller, for example, about maybe having that section where they agree to compensate you for additional time in order to at least prepare that buyer with the correct forms and the correct timeline, and make sure that they follow the procedures, et cetera, in order to get that deal closed, because that is to the benefit of your seller. So again, you want to have that conversation in a frank and open manner with your seller. And again, though, that needs to be the conversation, and you can't exclude people based on they're not gonna have an agent representing them. That is not something that I think that, at least that's how CAR sees it, that it could open you to a discrimination problem. Okay, back to the MLS. An MLS is a database of properties for sale, blah, 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 in case you weren't aware. What information is provided the MLS, all terms, including sales price, etc. And hang on a second. Seller consents to broker providing a copy of this listing agreement to the MLS if required by the MLS. Broker is a participant subscriber to an MLS listed in paragraph 23 or 2E1 of that contract, the one we just went over. Benefits of using MLS, impact of opting out of the MLS. Basically, I've always said that the number of eyes, the larger number of eyes that you have on your property, the likelihood of you selling that property goes up. So not having it on an MLS is not really a smart move. It may be one that seller wants to have, like he knows, 3 people that want to buy it, and he only wants you to deal with those 3 people. He can do that. But if it's just a general property that's going to go on the MLS, the likelihood of 3 people being one of them going to be the person that buys it don't go up as much as it does if you have, the entire state of California's eyes looking at it. You have a likelihood that goes up of properties being sold. The impact of opting out of the MLS is that reduction of an exposure, et cetera, may lower the number of offers. We all know that the more offers you have, the more interesting that price gets on that sales end. Not listing a property in a local MLS. If a property is listed in an MLS which does not cover the geographic area where the property is located, then real estate agents and brokers working that territory and buyers they represent looking for property in the neighborhood may not be aware the property is for sale. I think that's kind of sort of self-evident, but putting it in writing does help with the clarity. Clear cooperation policy. Unless paragraph 3F is checked, I've literally never seen it checked. The MLS rules require that the residential real property with 1 to 4 units and a vacant lot listings be submitted to the MLS within 1 business day of any public marketing. And I want to clarify this for just a minute here. Public marketing. Public marketing means flyers in the window at the office, posting it on social media, putting a sign in the window, anything along those lines. Posting a video. I'm at 123 Any Street, and it's going live next Thursday at 5. Okay, that's marketing. Anything that you do that identifies that property as for sale, it must be listed on the MLS within 1 business day. And the reason for that, by the way, clear cooperation, I think people just sort of say it without understanding what it means. When you have a property for sale, you're not holding that just for, you and your buddies and your office and nobody else can see it. The clear cooperation is that we have this property. This is the clear part. It's for sale. And we're going to cooperate with any and everybody who wants to see it. That's what that is intended for. Public marketing with clear cooperation includes but not limited to flyers displayed in windows, yard signs, digital marketing, public-facing websites, all those things that we just talked about, digital communications, marketing, and email blasts, say that 3 times fast, multi-brokerage listing sharing networks. There was a lawsuit about that actually fairly recently, where they had the off-market listings, and that was it was kind of hotly contested. But basically any public facing marketing will trigger that requirement to have it on the MLS. Coming soon status. And again, coming soon cannot be shown until it's available for everybody to see it. Seller is advised to discuss with the broker the meaning of coming soon, as that term applies to the MLS in which the property will be listed, and how any coming soon status will impact when and how a listing will be viewable to the public. So I believe it's 21 days that a property can be MLS coming soon on the MLS, and then it must go live, must go active. And the seller does or does not authorize the broker to market the property in the coming soon. The seller is instructing the broker to market the property at the beginning of listing period, or seller instructs the broker to begin marketing the property. So this is the formerly SELM. This section is what used to be this SELM. Basically, you're going to start marketing it on X date, or the seller instructs the broker not to market the property. And this might be where you're going to use that SELM if it's further than just a date. So for example, seller understands that no public marketing will occur, and the scope of the marketing will consist only of direct one-on-one promotion between the broker and licensees affiliated with the listing brokerage and their respective clients. So your seller is going to do a full bathroom remodel or a full kitchen remodel. And so the property is not going to be on the market for a month. You've got a listing. It's going to work on it. You're going to talk about it in your office. That's where you're going to use this. This is not going to be on the MLS. It's not coming soon. It's going to be more than the 21-day line for coming soon. But you may have some clients within your brokerage that have been looking for just such a gem. But those agents that you share it with must be within your brokerage and actually under the same broker license. The seller understands and agrees that should any public marketing of the property occur, the property listing will be submitted to the MLS within 1 business day. So we actually have had that happen where the seller, not understanding really how this worked, took the for sale sign and put it in the window of his house. Neighbor saw it, reported him, and then that house had to go on the MLS. And the seller wasn't exactly particularly happy about that. But that is what that happens. So we don't use the SELM. Yes, we do, but only in the case where it's going to be specific. So if you're going to just take a listing and it's not going to go on the market for a couple of weeks and you're not going to do a coming soon, you're just going to put this here. That used to be an SELM as well. Now the SELM, that you're going to just put that data in here. The seller instructs the broker not to market the property to the public, and that's for an extended amount of time, in which case an SELM would be appropriate. You really only have to give that to the MLS if asked. Some MLSs require it up front. Some will only ask for it will only require it if asked for it. But it's just more secondary now because we have coming soon, and we have the ability to have a date on here where, all right, we're not gonna list it for 3 weeks or whatever it is. It's not a huge amount of time, but it doesn't fall within coming soon. So we're not going to market it, and it's not going to be on the MLS, but I have the listing. Clear cooperation policy does not apply. I don't know of any MLS in California. There might be some, but I'm not aware of one that does not have the clear cooperation policy in effect. The MLS data on the internet, the MLS rules allow the MLS data to be made available. This is what I was talking about earlier, by the MLS to additional internet sites, unless the broker gives the MLS instructions to the contrary. Specific information that can be excluded from the internet as permissible by the or as accordance with the MLS is the property or property address, feature opt-outs, comments and reviews, approximated estimate of value, or the seller can elect to have the all listings information available to the internet sites, or they can elect out of certain internet features as provided by CAR form SELI or the local equivalent firm. So that's the form. So that's the one that says, I don't want it on the internet. I don't want it on secondary sites. I just want it on the MLS. I want agents to come show it. I don't want it on all of the internet sites, the interwebs, and everybody having information into, my bathroom colors, because it's super important. Seller concessions, you clarify in here, concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute toward a buyer expenses and other costs a buyer is responsible for in the transaction. Concessions may include, but are not limited to, cost of escrow or title, lender fees, repairs, inspections, and buyer broker compensation. So again, I've had this question a lot about, wait a minute, the seller pays for those fees, and the seller pays for repairs, and the seller, those have always been a concession. Anytime, if you'll notice on the contract, it says that the property is sold as is. That is the standard contract for the sale of a property in California. That property is sold as is unless something else is negotiated. So, and it even says in the form itself that the seller has no obligation to even answer a request for repairs. They don't have to do anything, just like they don't have to pay commissions, compensation. It's going to be a hard one to unlearn. Concessions may include the repair, title, and lender fees. Repair. So if the buyer says, I don't even have closing costs and I don't have lender fees, I don't have anything, I don't have any of those costs, the seller can absolutely pay them. That has always been the case. Is this MLSA now automatically included in the RLA package? Sorry if I missed that. I don't think it is. I'll have to check and see. That's a zip form question. I don't know. I don't know if it is automatically included or not. I would recommend including it just because I think it's helpful. And if it's, you're going to put your property in the MLS, that the seller should understand, A, that they have rights about whether or not they want it to be basically shown to, everybody or just the MLS. They can include or exclude it from other, other sites, and also what's on that. Okay, so, and this is another big one, by the way. Concessions identified in an MLS listing are not promises to pay, but instead indicate to a buyer that the seller will consider offers asking for concessions. Concessions specified in the MLS are not intended to be binding on the seller unless included in the accepted purchase agreement. This has always been the case. This has always also been misunderstood. If, for example, you have in the MLS that this property includes the brand new refrigerator in the laundry room and a washer and dryer and all kinds of cool things, but the buyer's agent does not write that into the contract, it's not included in the contract. It's not an automatic, because they said it in MLS, that we get it in the sale. You have to ask for it and rewrite it in the contract. Again, clear written understanding of those fence posts, right? Clear understanding of what's included, what's not included. You have to include it in the contract. Concessions specified in the MLS must be allowed to be used for any permissible buyer expense or cost and must not specify the concessions to be used for broker compensation. However, a term in the buyer's offer may specify that the seller agrees to pay all or a portion of the compensation that the buyer owes its broker. And that's 3G3 in the contract. Again, that's been there for, I think it's almost 2 years now. And then okay, we're good on questions. I don't know why I thought it was more. You guys are quiet. Quiet little church mice. Gosh, I gotta hurry. So seller does not authorize the broker to put in the MLS that the seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions, or the seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that the seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions. So you want to make sure that you check this when you take that listing. Photographs, again, visitors entering or touring the property may take photographs, and the buyer doesn't have the ability to control or block the taking and use of images. Seller can instruct broker to publish information in the MLS is limited to these persons preparing appraisal or inspection reports. So that has been, again, another problem recently. People coming to properties, taking videos of the house and posting it all over their social media without the permission of the seller. That has become a problem. It is difficult to, police that, but that is technically not allowed. And visitors are not restricted from taking pictures, or they instruct the broker to publish in MLS that taking of images is limited to those person preparing appraisal inspection reports. So again, those two things clarify what is allowed or not allowed. Okay, and then there's just a few real quick, I'm going to go through them really fast because we're almost out of time. I literally have 4 minutes. So, so if you're changing anything in your contract, obviously you're going to do a change form. And that's going to be disclosure and modification of the listing agreement, right? So again, I said everything has to be in writing. So this is the disclosure and modification to the listing agreement form. And again, the things that are in red are changed, which is you will no longer be available on the MLS. You, the seller, may be asked to deal with the compensation in other ways. Or, I mean, not you. Compensation will no longer be available in the MLS. And it will be, you can be, deal with compensation in different ways. And the BCA, which is what we just went over, is that. And then the modification of a listing agreement discusses the various ways a buyer's broker may be compensated. And it also added in here, the seller and broker agreed that the total compensation shall or shall not be reduced by the amount authorized and the offered in the MLS. So basically, what this is clarifying, again, you're clarifying the fence post, how this is going to be paid, who's going to pay it, where that is going to come from, and how it's going to be delineated in that contract. The other format is the modification of terms, which is the straight agreement on the listing contract itself, which is the expiration date. If the renewal exceeds 12 months on a residential 1 to 4 unit, this modification is void unless the seller is a corporation, LLC, or partnership. And the other is where you put things like, we're now going to exclude Aunt Edna's chandelier and the dishwasher is new, or whatever they want to add in there. This is where you're going to put that. And you can change the date, the time, the amount, all of that stuff can be changed on this form. Okay, one more, I think. Oh, the open house form. This is a good one. So this one is the one that you can have at your open house, and you can ask your open house visitors to sign. And it's a visitor intention to view the property. The agent is holding an open house or conducting in-person or live virtual tours of the property. Remember PEDS and the groups that had to go through all at one time? Agent agrees to show property to the visitor on the following terms. Agent does not represent visitor. Communication with the agent in open house is for the benefit of the seller. You don't represent them. You're not going to represent them. Thank you very much. If the visitor writes an offer on the property through the agent at any time, the agent will disclose if the agent and the agent's broker represent the seller exclusively, or both the seller and the visitor, or if the visitor wants to be represented by the agent holding the open house, then visitor should sign a representation agreement, such as a property showing and representation agreement, PSRA, or the buyer representation and broker compensation agreement, the BRBC. Those are the buyer agreement forms. This is what you have in the open house or at the open house for the benefit of your seller, because your seller wants to know the names of the people that are coming into his house or her house. And if the buyer refuses to sign, again, that's the conversation you have with your seller. You're not going to be a bouncer at the door, but you are going to ask for a name. And if they have an agent and if they're represented, and if not, they can say no. And this is where they put their information. It's just basic common sense, in my opinion, that you want to know who's coming into your open house. And if somebody refuses to sign, then you would have a decision again with your seller, whether you're going to let them in or not. You can have them sign a form that says, I refuse to sign. Like I said, you're not going to be tackling people. I don't think we're going to see a ton of that. They can just, you're probably going to get some Mickey Mouses and Donald Ducks on these forms, but you will have requested that information as well. Okay, we are out of time, and I think I just got in under the wire. Does anybody have any questions that were not answered? Probably, but we'll just pretend I got them all right. Can you use the modification of terms for the buyer's representation? Yes, there's actually a one specifically for the buyer's representation form. I didn't go over it today because we're doing the listing, but yes, that is absolutely available and there. And will be in additional, we're going to do another one on the buyer representation form, because that one I knew was going to change again and again. So up until I'm sure the date that we have that agreement signed by the DOJ, I think there may be still some tweaks. But realistically, we're really close to what that's going to be. So you can go in, and if you can't sleep, you can read through all of them, and your eyes will cross. It's quite fun, actually, to try and look at all of those forms. There's 67 of them, I think. So just related to this new agreement that we have with the buyer representation and the listing, which had to change again because of the representation agreement section. You really, there's not a lot of changes, but there are a lot of changes in the forms, right? So we're simply changing the way we're arranging how this pie gets split. But we have to clarify that again with the good fence posts. So thank you again all very much. You have been wonderful. I really appreciate your dedication to being here and to learning and understanding and moving forward. And please talk to your managers and brokers about having round robins in your offices. I think we're going to try and do one here at the board, and really try to get as much practice in as possible while this is still kind of forming. Be the professionals that you are and explain why this is important and how it helps both buyer and seller, and frankly, agents. And I will tell you one thing, and that is that in Northern California, where this has been in effect for a couple of years, there are at least 1 year. In Oregon, it's a couple of years. Their compensation actually went up because they showed their value, and they showed what they were presenting to as value to that buyer and seller. So good luck out there, and stay tuned. We'll be with you with more to come.